Welcome back. We are talking today with Chris Miller. We are talking about OIL and emergency management, and OIL standing for observations, insights, lessons identified, and lessons learned. Did I get it right?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So now you're going to talk to us how you were taking this OIL methodology and thinking to other areas. Can you tell us about that?
Indeed, I can. And that was what I originally thought we'd be talking about, because I kind of thought you'd all know about OIL and I wouldn't need any of that background stuff because it'd be all so well known. But it appears it wasn't as well known as I thought until especially when we started talking. Now, I worked with Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders for 8 years, and I quickly discovered in my short time with them that, and remember, we're talking about people who have a continuous culture of more than 60,000 years. So 8 years may seem like a long time in most people's careers. To Aboriginal people, it's just a blink in the eye. But that experience of cross-cultural awareness with them had translated when I worked for the World Bank in Africa. And I wasn't sure whether the OIL and this whole lessons management idea would work in a non sort of Anglo environment. If you look at those earlier slides, you know, coming from the US Army, a big defence background with NATO and the British Army, the Australian Army, emergency managers in Australia, and some business continuity managers here. It might work for sort of Anglo environment, but would it make sense cross-culturally? And the answer was, sure did. Those Swazis, they jumped on the bandwagon. They could see the logic. And that's a great relief, because I'm currently working for the World Bank on something called HEPA, which is the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response projects, which are a trust fund administered by the World Bank for the Japanese, German and Australian governments. So it's a sizable sum of money. And the preparedness part is where I'm working. The response part relates to COVID and following up from COVID. The WHO, the World Health Organization, and other donors have handed over lots of vaccines for COVID to low and middle income countries. But there's a big difference between getting a vaccine and getting vaccinated. And that's where the World Bank and some other donors are donating funds to translate those donated vaccines into large numbers of vaccinations for these populations in low and middle income countries. Now, the preparedness part is very far-sighted. So the Japanese, German and Australian governments realise that this isn't the only pandemic we may have to deal with. And so they want to get all of these lower middle income countries that are willing to participate with HEPA involved in better emergency preparedness. So they're sending old war horses like me in to try and work with these people and share some of the insights that 50 plus years in this game have given me. And lots of kindly people who've shared a lot of their lessons and their ideas and lots of my reading and so on and so on. A network through LinkedIn, you know, I've got 10,000 friends there. Just to inject some of that into their emergency managers so that they're in a better state of preparedness. And of course, we know that capturing lessons and feeding those lessons into future plans is part of that essential preparedness. So when I went to Swaziland, as it used to be, which is now called Eswatini, the Kingdom of, to do 2 weeks of a mission in May, I thought, well, what gift can I bring to these people? And I thought, I understand they've already been involved in a number of exercises. They have an international airport, so they're required to have the usual fire and rescue exercises, you know, where they have pretend people, plane crashes, all that kind of stuff that we all do at our large airports, just as part of our international accreditation. They've also had severe traffic accidents. They have a nice freeway that the Taiwanese built for them between their airport and major city, Mbabane. And they've run exercises on that. They've run exercises on fires because, like Australia, they have severe problems with droughts, although with our La Nina at present, it's flooding here. But I'm sure at some point in time we'll be back in the drought space again, and my Swazi friends are very well aware of that and have had bushfires to deal with too. So I knew they had a lot of experience, but what I wasn't so certain about is had they structured that experience in a way that that could be a platform for their future preparedness. And the answer was, oh yes, they could see what we're up to, they could see the logic, and they could appreciate that they needed to be more structured in their approach to capturing those lessons, capturing observations, insights, lessons identified and lessons learned when they had made the necessary changes to their current practices and plans and so on. And away they went. They're a young nation, they're very eager. Their average age is 60.3 or something. So you give them an idea, just get out of the way and let them get on with it. And this is a good example. That's nighttime. This workshop with various 4 groups, it started at 5 a.m. for me and it finished after 7 p.m. that night. And the only reason it finished then was because dinner was served. They work really hard and they work their consultants really hard. In case you're wondering where it is, it's surrounded mostly by South Africa, but shares a border with Mozambique. And as you see, it isn't all work. We did have some fun and we had very nice food at the mountain inn. So if you go to Mbane, good place to eat and also a good place to run workshops. This room here you're looking at is their public health emergency operations centre, which is where they ran their COVID response and other COVID related activities. And they also had landslides and Cyclone Eloise. So they've had all sorts of incidents. They also have a national disaster management agency, as you would expect in most countries these days. So O.I.L.L made sense to them. The whole notion of capturing, because they did have a lot of observations, insights and lessons, but maybe not the methodology and structure to capture those and make the best use of them moving forward. And after the workshop,
that's what I was going to ask. If they had some sort of loose structure in place, but just nothing formalized to help them move forward.
Possibly. It was possibly in the heads of a lot of people. So for instance, this gentleman here, that's me with the pink mask on, this gentleman here who heads up their HEPA program in Eswatini for the Ministry of Health, Dr. Mazazala, he would have a lot of it in his head, but whether it was documented, whether it was in a way that his team could readily access, whether it was injected to future plans, before I started talking to them about those sort of ideas, maybe less than was optimal, and hopefully they'll be more sensitized to doing that moving forward. We also briefed some very senior people. Another meeting we had here, we had one of the deputies for their Ministry of Health, and what we call in Australia first assistant secretary, so someone just the next level down. So these are people that would report directly to the chief executive, the principal secretary, as is called, Simon, in Eswatini. So we did get an opportunity to influence at all levels. So hardworking people such as my friend here, Zizanda, middle managers such as Dr. Medazala, and very senior people. This lady here, yep, there she is. She's an assistant commissioner of police. So we dealt with a very significant cross-section of their leadership team in the kingdom.
I guess that kind of goes back to what you were saying in the first segment, is get a wide variety and cross-section of those that have or can influence, a response to situations or preparedness or something like that, not just specific little groups, like the suggestion you had earlier with Kangaroo Island and Fraser Island, not just the people with the hoses trying to put out the fire, but the rest of the community as well. And that's what happened here. I can see as well as you're describing it, right?
Yes, and before the workshops. So the workshops, we had a 2-week mission. The workshops were held in the second week. The first week, we spend a great deal of time with what we call multisectoral engagement. So we went around, we're working, remember, on health emergencies. So we went around and met all sorts of people. For instance, we met the people in agriculture and the veterinary science, because 70% of significant infectious diseases of concern in public health are zoonotic. So they arise from animals. So the sentinels, the people who are likely to be giving you the intel that, hey, Houston, you could have a problem here, are the people in the vet and agricultural space. And often you get a situation such as we got with one of the bird flu pandemics in China, where we had a whole lot of sick farmers, but we also had a whole lot of sick hens and chickens that had to be disposed of. And the two, it was first, oh, but I've got all these sick chickens, and by the way, I'm not feeling too well myself. It's that kind of interface. It's making sure you get that intel so that you know you've got a problem, so you can contain the problem before it becomes a bigger problem. Eswatini is only a small country of about 1.4 million people, so things can spread very quickly when you've got a relatively small footprint. And I also do work in Timor-Leste, and the same problem applies there. You need to get that surveillance, get that alert status before the emergency, or before it gets into a bigger emergency, a bigger outbreak. So getting those relationships in place. And as one of my colleagues so well described it, Superintendent Joe was speaking to me from New South Wales Police, who looked after water police and a whole lot of cruise ships during COVID times. Oh, lucky him. Anyway, he said the time to meet these multisectoral colleagues is not when you're here in the Public Health Operations Emergency Operations Centre, FEOC, when you're exchanging business cards, but preferably that you have met here in workshops and preparedness and exercises, so that you do understand the scope and limitations, what you can do and what you can't do that might be helpful when you find yourself in a response environment.
Well, that actually leads me to my next question. How do you build OIL, not just in Eswatini, but overall? How do you build it for ongoing success, not just a one-time thing based on, a single event, and then the next event comes along and, it's all messed up, not handled the same way? So what's a good way of setting it up for long-term success?
Well, they actually have set it up for long-term success in Eswatini extremely well. So although I'm there focusing on the health emergencies, I mentioned that they have a National Disaster Management Agency, which is headed up by Russell Dalmeny. And Russell attended the workshops. He sent his people, Victor, who's a desk officer for the health sector, to these workshops, and other colleagues from his team. He is the strategic operator as the leader of the organisation, and they're more involved in the tactical and operational elements. But all of what was going on in the workshops is being fed into his bigger superstructure plan. So they have a national plan, of which there's a significant element relating to the health sector, but then there's much more detailed plans. And again, each of those plans captures the lessons. And further, in the Ministry of Health, a fellow called Mr. Damascene runs their project management office. Remember I talked about project management offices in Australia? You can imagine how pleased I was to meet the fellow that heads up the Ministry of Health project management office in Eswatini. So they are doing the same good things that we're doing. Maybe someone shared these ideas with them. Maybe they thought of it for themselves, who knows? But they're ahead of the curve, and they're doing some of the things that we identified in the first segment as being helpful.
Any tips, because we're getting near the end of our show today, any tips for organizations, communities, to really change the way they're doing lessons learned? What are some of the things they should look at, whether we know they're being successful or not? what are some of the tips that maybe you have from your obviously a lot of experience with this? Start doing this. Take a look to see if you're doing that. Those kind of things.
Well, find brave managers. Because you got to have a champion that's willing to listen to things that may not show their organization in the best light. Even though I'm careful in my after action reviews to speak about what went well. In Australia, we consider getting people out of harm's way and having no deaths is super good, because some of the wildfires that you would have seen images of, and you've had a few of them yourself in Canada, and the Americans know all about it too, unfortunately. Sometimes it is impossible to fight them. The real success in emergency management is getting people out of harm's way and then dealing with it when things calm down, or when the rains come, or when it's actually possible to contain it. So maybe setting the parameters of success more realistically, because in Australia and other places, you can't stop these fires hitting. You can't stop the flooding that we're going to have with La Nina. But what you can do is get people out of harm's way. And for instance, with this cyber attack, really, you opened APIs so that these unpleasant creatures could get in there. Yes, your data was encrypted, but geez, it doesn't take much to get unencrypted software that can unencrypt things, by the way. Couldn't you have been a bit more ahead of the curve? So this whole notion of preparedness. So the cycle I often see is, what went well, what went less well, how could we have been better prepared for the next whatever? So building bigger levees if it's flooding. In the case of cyber attack, stop hanging on to your customers' data when you don't actually need it. Because you need the data to identify the customer, but once they're identified, do you really need their identification data on an ongoing basis? Or could you set some sort of timeline after which that data will be sensibly destroyed so that the traces of it are not available to be sold on the dark web? So a lot of it is about the cycle of preparedness, response. We called it PPRR in Australia, so prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. But all of that's about resilience. So if you can get prepared through learning these lessons and making the necessary changes so that you're in a better state of preparedness for the next event. And that takes courage, and it takes investment, and it takes following up on a lot of the ideas that we've shared in the session this evening.
Well, we have exactly 3 minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to convey on lessons learned, OIL, anything?
Well, some free resources.
Oh, everyone loves free resources.
I know everybody's big on free resources. Now, I mentioned our friends, the US Army. This book was put out first in the 1980s and has been updated a few times since, but they have a quarterly e-newsletter that's free that you might wish to subscribe to. I mentioned earlier about the Australian Institute of Disaster Resiliency. Over here are some segments from their free, you can download them off their website, proceedings from their lessons management forum that they held back in March in Brisbane, in my hometown. They also have a lessons management handbook that my colleague Mark Cuthbert, that everyone calls Bert, helped write. It's getting a bit old now, 2019. They might have to engage Bert to update it, but it also has models and examples as a companion document along with case studies. It's all freely available through ADARE, the Australian Institute of Disaster Resiliency. You've got their website there, and you can go and freely make access of these resources, which they'd love you to make use of. And if you've got comments, other ideas about how we could do better, I'm sure the ADARE folks would love to hear from you. So free resources, that's the best I can offer.
Any personal final comments?
Yeah, I've really found OIL has helped me structure my thinking, because I think before OIL came into my life and into my practice in emergency management and business continuity, I probably had a whole lot of lessons, a whole lot of observations. It was a bit unstructured. Maybe my qualitative sociology training helped me organise it a bit, but I think it's helped improve the rigour by which I capture those lessons and manage those lessons from being identified to real change in the client organisations I work with through their risk and audit committees and other people, the project management officers and so on, who can follow that up, because as a consultant, I obviously come and go.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end. Chris, thank you very much. I really appreciate all the talk on lessons management and OIL and how people can, really adapt and adopt this kind of thing. I know there's lots of talk, about lessons learned, but not a lot of people really dig into it to give what it really means and how to go about doing it. As you put, a single workshop may not cover it and isn't really the best way. And so I really liked some of the examples and different ways of looking at it to get the really best thing you need to move forward from, unfortunately, often negative situations. So I really appreciate you coming and talking with us today.
Thanks, Alex. And of course, like you, I can be easily found on LinkedIn. Always happy to have a chat.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. And to everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody.
Thank you. Wise advice.
If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.